All right, we've got a good number of people, and people will keep trickling in as we go, and they can catch up. So, hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Michael Grecco for his book Punk, Post-Punk, New Wave, On Stage, Backstage, In Your Face, 1978 through 1991, in conversation with Jim Sullivan. My name is Bree, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you all join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors, artists, and the independent bookstore through your purchase and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other attendees. And please drop your questions in the Q&A box because the chat can move pretty quickly and we don't want to lose any of those. Please note that the Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Right now, I would like to welcome my two new friends. Thank you so much for joining us, our moderator, Jim Sullivan. He wrote about pop music and culture for the Boston Globe, 1979 through 2005, and is currently doing the same for WBUR's Artery, among other websites and outlets. And then the man of the hour tonight, Michael Grecco, is an award-winning commercial photographer and film director noted for his iconic celebrity portraits, innovative magazine cultures, editorial images, and advertising spreads. His distinguished work is regularly featured in prestigious galleries all around the world. Punk, Post-Punk, and New Wave features stunning, never-before-seen photography from this iconic period in music. In addition to concert photography, Michael has also shot album covers and promotional pieces that round out this impressive, extensive photo collection. And thank you both so much, and I will leave it to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That is the world's longest book title, right? I think we've got the world's longest book title there. So I guess Bree just muted herself and left us. I am going to start the conversation tonight by showing you guys, by sharing my screen, showing you guys a video and a presentation talking about it so that you get a sense of the images and you can see the images and understand what we're talking about. So let me start this up. I have to hit the share screen button first. Here we go. All right, we should probably take the Q&A off of there though. Here we go. Whoops.
Michael, there's no pictures up there. It's just the audio.
Oh, wow. Okay, hang on a second. Let's try that again. Sorry about that. Hold on. Always better when someone else runs the the technical stuff. Let me see what's going on here. Hang on. Gonna do it this way. Okay, let's share screen again. This one here. And this one here. Pictures now?
Yes.
All right. And you can hear my voice still, yes?
Yes.
All right. So the book, punk, post-punk, new wave, on stage, backstage, in your face, 1978 to 1991, basically is a collection of images of mine from my days as a club kid, on the scene of really a music genre and musical time that I loved and was a part of to a certain extent. So during in 1978, during the blizzard of 78 in Boston, I was about to start an internship with the Associated Press. I had taken a photojournalism course. I had studied photojournalism at the School of Communications at Boston University, and was just about to start my internship at AP when I skied into the Associated Press office, put on all my ski clothes. No one could move. No one can get through the city. And I trudged through with goggles and gloves and ski equipment and, liners over my clothes and all of that, and came in with 3 rolls of film. And that started my career as a photojournalist. At the same time, I was living in the 700 Towers. I lived in the area. I lived in the 700 Towers and on Marlborough Street in Mass Ave for many years. And I stumbled into the Rat and very much got excited about the music. So this is my preface to the book I'm going to read. When I came of age in the late 70s and early 80s, it was in the middle of an artistic rebellion that changed the face of politics and culture forever. This was the era of punk, bold, self-expressed, and free, an era of music, attitude, and fashion that spat in the face of the established norms. I had grown up in the middle of an old world Italian household in suburban New York. Tradition and rules marked my childhood. I was told how to be, how not to be. I felt stifled. Walking into my first punk club in Boston at age 18, I found I suddenly joined a club where everybody belonged. I could finally be myself, or at least find out who I really was. So I was a jazz listener. This is the cover of the new book. Introduction, amazing introduction, and Jim was able to help me tie the whole book together and get Fred Snyder to do the forward. This is the cover of the book. So essentially, I was a jazz listener as a kid, really hated traditional commercial rock and roll and traditional commercial rock and roll radio, and very much got into the punk and alternative music scene as it was developing in Boston. And I don't know if many of you realize this, but Boston was the landing place for every one of these bands. Every band at the time, and I don't know if that's true now, but every band started their tour in Boston. It was their first show. So it was the closest flight from England to the United States. And it also became a warm-up for New York. So if the record companies felt like New York was really important, which most of them did, they were able to play Boston, Providence, New Haven, and then do New York. They were able to get acclimated to the time zone and get some rehearsing in and practice in and get ready for New York. So, and Boston was the first stop of every tour. Doesn't matter if it was a US band, doesn't matter if it was a UK band, where the band was from. I think the record company AR people just got lazy and they had their tours set up, and it was the way they did the tour. They knew which club to call next or what town the people had to be in. So I was into jazz. I was also into Bowie and Roxy Music and the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed but punk really had this free expression. I mean, you will see it here with the Cramps in this series. And I was also, I was sort of a hanger-on. I was a club kid. I was friends with and hung out with the people in the music industry. in Boston and in the club scene. And that gave me entree to photographing these bands. And then eventually I picked up assignments for magazines like Boston Rock, and I worked for WBCN. I love this sequence with Lux Interior where he's singing, because, every time I perform on stage, I lose my pants completely. I think it's very important that you have to lose your pants really to make sure the audience is noticing and watching. Part of me also, I was very inspired as a kid, even before I studied photojournalism, by photographers like Annie Leibovitz, who was just getting noticed, and Avedon and Penn, Irving Penn, and really loved this idea of portraiture. And for me, a portrait meant that you had access to the band, and it was important. And then you got to express yourself, and you got to have this dance with the subjects in the band. So this is a portrait of Poison Ivy backstage. All these portraits too are sort of impromptu, right? Because they're backstage, they're just off a show. I'm back there with a flash on camera, bouncing the light into the ceiling, trying to convince them to take portraits, doing it very sort of very impromptu. And this is Lux and his portrait. He went and got a hot dog bun from the craft services table to do his portrait. Was also a time, it was a time of great artistic freedom, which also meant a time of great freedom for female bands. This is the Slits. And again, right off stage, I don't know if it was on stage or off stage, but a quick shot of them, a quick couple of frames, portrait style. And this is the Plasmatics. Lost my hearing for a week after Wendy O. Williams shot a shotgun off next to my ear. She almost crossed into a little bit of a metal act, but the freedom and raucousness, that everyone had, really was, I think, a rebellion against commercial radio. I really think that commercial radio was so stifled artistically. It was so formulaic that all of these bands, wanted to figure out cool things to do. I don't know, those of you who remember the Late Risers Club, but that's Greg Riebman in the MIT studio with Adam Ant holding up a New York Dolls album. This is done for WBCN, Oedipus, and Adam Ant, the band Adam Ant. I was sort of, I was hanging out with all of these bands. Two of those musicians, I forget which two, I think it's the guy on the bottom and the guy second to the right, were like over my house all night, listening to records, drinking vodka, and doing blow. And I had like a tiny 1-bedroom apartment. It was that picture in the beginning that had midnight blue walls. So if I had to sleep all day, I could, like, the place was really dark. So I would hang with the band. I was on assignment. I would hang out with Adam and the band all day during his radio appearance, take him out outside at MIT, ask him to do some portraits and pose. Then he played the Paradise. I'm shooting him at the club. I'm shooting him on stage. And that was sort of it. It's like, I didn't consider myself a concert photographer, but more of someone photographing this movement, this musical movement, and this culture, I have other projects. I've did a book on the Adult Video Awards. I've shot performers on Venice Beach, and I'm really drawn to photographing subcultures. And this was sort of my first subculture, and I happen to be a part of this subculture. This is the Boston band Human Sexual Response. I was their official photographer. Went to England with them, traveled to New York with them all the time, did drugs with them. That's Oedipus, famous DJ and program director from WBCN. This is when the Humans signed their first record deal with Rykodisc with Don Rose. It was a small community. We all knew each other. So, you know, if I was following the Buzzcocks around all day, which is this is them at WMBR, I then took them to their hotel room and did portraits of them. That's Pete Shelley and the rest of the band, Steve Diggle in the Mirror, David Byrne and Adrian Ballou. You know, it's very casual back then. You had an incredible, I had access in the situations because I was part of the scene, and the DJs that were allowed backstage knew me and everyone knew me and I was allowed backstage. You know, I also had access because I was shooting for, you know, Boston Rock and I had an assignment, but things were very low key. You would show up to David Byrne's room and he was listening to Pygmy music on a tape recorder, and like there was no publicist there. It's like, come on, David, let's go to the lobby. I'm going to take a picture of you in the lobby with Adrian. Adrian's waiting already, you know. This is my probably third night of hanging out with The Clash. Oedipus and I drove down to the Cape Cod Coliseum. I had spent some time with them in New York, and I think I had hung out with them the night before. It was at least a 2-night show at the Cape Cod Coliseum. This is from Bonds in New York, Joe Strummer. Kind of situation. I at the time, I sort of, you know, being a wild club kid, I always had a little, you know, cocaine, a little blow in my pocket. And I think Topper and I wound up doing lines backstage. And then I heard the night after they fired him. And I found out later they fired him for a heroin addiction, not because of cocaine abuse, but it was still pretty, it was still pretty weird. Jello Biafra and the Dead Kennedys, the Channel, you know, and you have to realize that I was being trained by the best photographers of the Associated Press. So I knew when to use flash, you know, direct flash on camera. I knew how to bounce it into the ceiling for a portrait. And, you know, I had good technical chops. I was being trained, you know, well. So the Ramones at the Channel, Billy Idol. Any of you that know Irving Penn's work, you know, he built this corner in his studio and he would always photograph these people in his corner. It was a little, you know, device that he did. So in reference to that, because I studied classical photography and classical in, I should say, modern and contemporary, but I studied what would be the masters. And this to me was reminiscent of that wall. I put Billy in the corner here. And this is the last picture of the series. I'd moved to LA. This is where I was putting together and making more, doing more conceptual sessions. This is Daniel Ash of Love and Rockets. And I brought a pyrotechnics guy with me and decided to photograph him by the flame of the fire, you know, as a reference to Love and Rockets. So this is the back cover of the book. There's the back cover of the book. Human League. I think this was at Spit. It's just the stage lighting, really. And here is the cover of the book again. The world's longest title, punk, post-punk, new wave, on stage, backstage, in your face. I will stop sharing screen and come up here. So I think I'm on. Jim, any comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say my involvement in this was Michael asked me to contribute this introductory essay somewhere, well, I guess last year sometime. I wrote it from January through March. And what I did was I drew upon many of the same people that Michael had shot, some others as well, people I talked to in the course of that era that Michael covered photographically. And in a sense, my job, I felt, was to complement what he was doing in pictures with words and maybe give it a certain extra dimension, if you will. It was a scene that was both hedonistic and nihilistic at times. Pleasure, pain, as Michael mentioned, sex and drugs, all kinds of stuff. And there was one thing, I just wanted to read one of the quotes I had. This was from 1979 when The Clash first came here, played Harvard Square Theater, and I spent some time with them seeing the show and talking to them backstage. And one of the quotes from Joe Strummer, which I just loved, I'll just read it here. He says, I was asking him about having an ambition to be a rock and roller. And he was saying, how can there be a band like Yes and have a secret ambition to be a rock and roller? You think, forget it, I'll go back to my cleaning shop. Now people in England realize that anybody can be a star, and that goes without exception. And that's a vital thing in rock and roll. The beginners, they gotta realize they can be stars, otherwise they ain't gonna bother with it. And in many ways, he was right. The entrance point was fairly low in terms of learning a few chords, creating something that meant a lot to you, whether it was commercial or not commercial, and letting it fly. And while there was a lot of crap, as everybody will agree, a lot of great stuff came through that, and bands developed and grew, learned more about music, learned more about production, and it became a scene that was very, I guess the best word is just to say very varied. I mean, there were so many different strands of what fell under the punk or new wave rubric that it was terrific. And I know Michael and I have talked about this in Boston. There were times, there were weeks when he and I could be out 4 or 5 times a week just because the bands were that good. You wanted to be out doing that. Granted, I was writing about this for the Globe. He was shooting it maybe on assignment, maybe not. So, I mean, there was a work/pleasure thing that went on with me as it went on with him. But it was a great time to be alive and a great time to be in rock and roll.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we didn't. That's a really interesting perspective from Jim. I didn't even realize how special what we were involved with was until my archivist kept pulling images out of the file and was like, dude, you have to do something with this. This has been, books take a long time. This has been a 5-year project of editing, scanning, going through 40, I have 40 file drawers of film. I have 10 file cabinets filled with 42 years of shooting and 42 years of film. It will be 43 years this January. And it really, it's a project, and we edited. So most of this has never been scanned and never been seen before. We edited the work right up until, the last moment. We got a commitment from the publisher, I think in August. I reached out to Jim. We went into production in November, December. We shipped the book in March. We were still scanning and pulling stuff out of the file. We realized, and as I talk about it and do these events, we realized I realized now, like, what a scene we were part of, and what times they were and how wonderful they were. And, a couple of nights I wasn't shooting stills. I was on stage with The Cure at the Underground and on stage with the Buzzcocks at the Bradford Ballroom shooting video. And then Pete Shelley and the band would come over, and, it wound up in looking at it in retrospect, they were incredible times.
My understanding is Pete Shelley had a real interest in you, Michael.
Yes, Pete Shelley kept handing me his phone number, grabbing my hand and telling me I need to come to England. And I was so freaking naive at the time. I was like, oh, that's nice. Thank you, Pete. That's very, very nice.
Yes. I don't know if he was exactly officially out of the closet, and I think he was bisexual, as it turns out, to begin with. But it sort of was not even mentioned. I guess it wasn't even really an issue at all. But anyway.
All right, so we have the Q&A box here somewhere. I'm trying to look for it on Zoom. window, Zoom webinar.
Back.
Oh, hey,
I'm
Bree.
happy to help. I'm happy to help with the Q&A.
All right. And we did practice this. I saw your
I know.
comments there. We did practice this, man. Like, come
We logged
on.
in a full half hour before we went live. It
Exactly.
worked great. And of course, all right, let's see. So did you ever shoot the Wipers or the Nervous Eaters or John Cale?
Oh, no, big fan of John Cale. I saw Lou. And I don't know if when Lou was Lou, if Cale played with Lou. And because
He didn't.
Yeah. So I don't think I actually saw John Cale, but the Nervous Eaters, man, we were friends with, we were friends with those guys, and hung out. Like that was the thing. The Boston bands would hang out at Spit, at the Hoodoo Barbecue, which was upstairs from the Rat in Kenmore Square. I mean, people would just hang out. We'd hang out with all of them. So Nervous Eaters played all the time.
All right, this one is a personal, selfish question, but I'm super curious about Boston venues. I know the Rat is obviously legendary. I unfortunately never got to go myself, but where were some of your favorite venues to shoot?
The Rat had no light. So the Rat was a terrible place to shoot. It was crowded. People were right up to the stage. And the Paradise was like, you can have a tea and sit at a table and get food to eat. And the Paradise was fine. You needed like a good table in front. And you needed to be able to get between the tables. The Channel was like, all hell would always break loose at the Channel. Like the Channel was just wild. And the Bradford Ballroom was just also wild. You can get up to the stage, and they had this great glass block wall. Those of you who get the book, there's this nice portrait of the Specials with this glass block wall behind them. There were nice shooting spaces at the Bradford Ballroom, but the Channel was just like the most raucous for sure.
Now, the Bradford, is that the Brighton Music Hall now?
No, that's
No?
Royale.
Oh,
is
okay.
what it is now. That's
All right.
where it's located.
Cool. Yeah, I've been to some good shows at the Royale for sure.
Yeah,
That's the Bradford Ballroom.
yeah, that's what it's called now. Yeah, there were some really good things there. I actually saw Miles Davis at the Bradford, the first and only time I saw him. And strangely enough, he kept his back to us, but he did that all the time. Anyway, but there were some great venues, and I mean that's the thing about Boston at the time. There were I don't know, half a dozen, 8, 10, all of which hosted bands, on a nightly basis that we were interested in. And, I mean, what Michael was saying about access was sort of true in my world as well. Yes, there were liaisons and publicists and things here and there, but there was an awful lot of being able to talk your way into a situation or a place. For me to do whatever I did in terms of backstage interviews or side stage viewing or whatever. And for Michael with his photography. And so it was lax in that sense, and it was good lax. It wasn't. Those are very different times. People were not uptight. This was way pre 9/11. It was a very liberating era, and it was a real good free flow of information and good vibes, I think.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah,
I would agree. You definitely had access. It's like. I got a backstage pass usually if I was on assignment, but even if I didn't, I would have access. We have a question here from Lonnie Smith. Where did you usually stand to take pictures, especially for the Boston shots, more especially for the Naked Lux pictures? I mean, the picture of him with the hot dog bun was backstage. I always wanted to, like I said, it's why I moved to Los Angeles to be a portrait photographer, so that I could, because I think for me creatively, I was a good photojournalist, but creatively I like to construct scenarios and pose people, and I found portraits more creative. But so that was backstage, and I always tried to get backstage. But the pictures of him on stage, that's the Channel, and that's the side of the stage, because the front of the stage was what's it called, a mosh pit. So the front of the stage was a mosh pit, and people were, it was just wild, right? He was falling into the audience, and But I also worked for a little agency in Providence, Rhode Island, a magazine assignment agency called Picture Group. And this guy who was the owner of the agency, Don Abood, who's no longer with us, would always go, don't get the microphone in front of their mouth. Don't get the microphone in front of their mouth. Good concert pictures never have the microphone in front of their mouth. So, I would not be in the front because the whole microphone stand and everything would be right in their face. I'd be off to the side 3/4, or in that case, I was sideways, just waiting for him to turn. I mean, there's a sequence of like 5 pictures in the book that are just like off the chart. I mean, and it's all Lux. Lux is like a spastic, like he looks like he's electrocuted or something. When he performs, he really, really, gets wild.
There's one shot Michael's got in there too that has Lux and his wife Ivy, the guitar player, in it as well. And it was a great act in a way, because he was this feral frontman, very visceral in your face. And her role was to be the sort of sexy guitarist churning out these great monster riffs, but looking at him with almost diffidence and sometimes almost disdain. Granted, that was an act. There was also a ferocity about the Cramps that was rather interesting, because off stage, Lux and Ivy were the sweetest people in the world, just very soft-spoken and very reflective. And so it was one of my first experiences of meeting people, of seeing somebody on stage, being somewhat intimidated by that, meeting them backstage, and then realizing, oh, they're pussycats, they're great people.
Yeah. Well, so we have a question from Evan Schwartz, which I like. You had moved it into off of the queue.
Oh no, did I?
It's okay. But I mean, Evan mentions that, because it relates to a good story. Evan mentions that the Clash at Bonds in 81, it was 81, and it was oversold. The tickets were oversold, and they had to add more shows. It did stretch out for 2 weeks. I think it was the closing of Bonds. It was Bonds' last hurrah as a nightclub, but the Clash were there for 2 weeks. And Tristram Lozow, who was my editor, writer at Boston Rock, and my editor, good friend of mine, really close friend of mine. He was like, hey, there was this woman in the scene, Anne Marie. He's like, Anne Marie knows Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols. So you're going to go with Steve Jones and Anne Marie. He's in Boston. You're going to drive down to, I don't remember I think we all drove down. You're going to drive down to New York, and Steve Jones is going to get you backstage and get you to take pictures of the Clash. I'm like, cool. So we were like, drive all the way, from Boston, 4 hours to New York, like in the middle of the night. I don't know why, what set the hours. We crashed on a floor. I slept on a floor in New York with Steve Jones. And the next day we're like, it was oversold. We couldn't even get to the club, and we had at least passes to get in, not backstage passes. And Jonesy is at the backstage door, like begging to get in. Hey, it's Steve Jones and Sex Pistols. And they're like, who? What? No, there's too many people in the place. No. So Jones wound up getting us in there. It's like, and as I do in the book, I'm like, oh yeah, I slept on the floor with Steve Jones one time from the Sex Pistols. It's like, so like I said, there've been good memories. So
one of the good stories that I had was from Peter Hook, Joy Division Newater, after Newater played the Underground Club for the first time. And he was trying to recall, he said, I think this is what happened, that he slept on the floor of the promoters. It was Jim Coughlin. He didn't remember his name. And he said he remembered everybody just sort of on the floor, everybody in the band, with cockroaches crawling all over them. And Jim Coughlin, I later got in touch with, and he said, well, I'm not sure either. I think they probably did. Most people did. And yeah, that sounds about right. So those were the days.
I can't believe that Kaufman. There used to be right where the Green Line turns on Commonwealth Avenue, and it makes that left right there in one of the buildings. What's the street that's straight, Jim? I haven't been there for 35 years. What's the street if you went straight? where the green line turns.
Oh, Brighton Ave, I think. Brighton.
All right, so
yeah.
so Brighton Ave goes straight. Right across the street from that turn, on that corner on Com Ave, he had a club in an apartment, in a basement apartment. Like, who the hell like, I mean, eventually they had to close it down, but The Cure played there the first time. New Order played there the first time. The Bauhaus played there the first time. Bauhaus played there the last time because they tore the ceiling tiles out and ripped the whole place to shreds. But it's like, you know, they were these incredible experiences, because the first Cure concert in the United States was in a room as big as, you know, someone's living room.
But it was L-shaped too. That was the other thing about it. So that, I mean, if you were in the part of the L where you could see the stage, well, not right, but sort of you could see the stage. And then the other L was, well, okay, you can kind of hear the music coming around the corner, but you couldn't see anything.
I forgot all about that.
And I remember, actually, I was there for the closing night. The Neats played, Boston band, great Boston band. And the final song they played was Another Broken Dream, a very apt song to close out a club's history with. And I believe there were ceiling tiles that were taken down that night and ripped out, as is often the case when a club closes.
Well, hopefully somebody saved them for a keepsake.
Maybe.
Were either of you ever on assignment or shooting at the gun club? That's not a venue I'm familiar with.
No, that's a band, the gun club.
Oh.
No?
Yeah, I was going to say, no, there are gun clubs with guns, but no, it is a band. Oh, yeah, actually,
I've shot them. I never shot them. I've seen the gun club, though, so.
Oh, they were sort of what the Cramps were to rockabilly, the Gun Club were to R&B, and Jeffrey Lee Pierce, the late leader of the Gun Club, was very much a Cramps guy. In fact, Kid Congo Powers played in both bands, coming from the Cramps to the Gun Club, or Gun Club to the Cramps, I forgot. But same sort of messy exuberance. And not exactly a reference for the genre they came from. Respect for it, and then the idea of crashing beyond the boundaries. And
who's a Boston photographer. I worked for the Boston Phoenix also. She worked for the Real Paper. I was living in the Ground Zero loft, the band The Ground Zero, and I was living in their loft, right? Or staying with her in their loft. And like 1980 New Year's Eve party, twice they had James White and the Blacks and James Chance and the Contortions, obviously the same guy if you know the bands, and it's very funny, Jim. Emmy Malone is joined and has just sent us a question. Jim was dating Emmy, and then I started dating Emmy. So
that is true.
I always felt a little guilty.
Well, I will know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I will answer. But you know, some of those nights, I mean, James Chance was freaking amazing, you know, and I think it was a case when he was on, you know, he had a saxophonist, you know, and you wish that I was shooting all the time, but I was, you know, very much part of the scene. So Emmy Malone, Mary Ellen Malone asks, what do you miss about those days? I think it was good that I left them where they were so that I'm still alive to talk about them today.
And another part, what do you miss least about those days?
Oh, what do you miss least about those days? Oh, sorry. Probably the drugs and, you know, all the craziness that went on with it. So
sleeping on the floor, the cockroaches.
There were no cockroaches in this New York apartment with
That's
Steve
impossible.
Jones.
There's not a single New York apartment without cockroaches.
All right. I was just told I snored a lot. That's all. I don't know what they were appropriate times for my age and the time. So I don't think they'll be relived in music. I couldn't relive them. I mean, I could tour with a band now and shoot them. I don't know if I'd be up all night doing drugs and partying with the band. It's like, it's just a different, I moved to Los Angeles, had kids and got married and chose a different lifestyle. So
let's see. CJ wants to know, is it true that if you ever use the bathroom at the Rat, you are now immune to COVID?
You never use the bathroom at the Rat. You really, first of all, it had no door, right?
God.
Isn't that right, Jim? It had no door.
Yeah, it was either no door or broken door. And I mean, the general rule of thumb was you could pee at the Rat, never do anything else at the Rat, never, ever. Leave the Rat, find another place if you really have to do that.
It was so gross. It was so gross.
You rivaled CBGB's bathroom, of course, is infamous. I mean, that is the most infamous bathroom in the world, with the open toilets and cesspool vibe. But the Rat did come close. I mean, much like the Rat was sort of like CB's younger brother with the bands that played there and the audience that it attracted, it was sort of the same in bathroom ratings as well.
So I'm wondering, now that you've kind of like moved beyond or past, grown out of being a punk club kid, where do you see punk today? Like, I know that the scene is changed and music has gone in a different direction, but punk is still alive, right?
Yeah, so go ahead, Mike.
I think that, I think that the hardcore, beat on the brat with a baseball bat, and the Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen, she ain't a human being, was out of a time of frustration with radio and the music industry, and at the same time cultural frustration, economic frustration, high unemployment in both countries, high inflation, lines at the gas station, kids out of school couldn't get jobs. Just a very, frustrating era. And at the same time, a lack of self-expression on the radio, which is where we did hear music, other than walking into a music store and having Greg Reedman tell you what to buy, which is what I used to love to do. We did hear, we all listened to the Late Risers Club. We all listened to Demi Moan. We would listen to those shows for what the latest was. And I don't think there'll be ever quite an equivalent to it, because you had socioeconomic conditions that help create it, but it opened the door for creative music. Like, it really opened the door for creative music. And I came from that bent. I listened to the art ensemble. I was a jazz listener as a kid, and I listened to the art ensemble of Chicago and Anthony Braxton and very avant-garde jazz. And I think that it's opened up the doors to very creative music that still continues.
I think one of the key things now too is the means of discovery are so much different with the internet, with Spotify, Deezer, with the YouTube, with the many ways you can discover a band. Back when Michael and I were doing this, it was really word of mouth, flyers, singles that you might have bought, and Newbury Comics, maybe reading the NME or Melody Maker from England, getting tipped off that way, word of mouth from friends. It was a very different world of discovery from the fan end of it. And from the band end of it, they really had to work their way up from the smaller clubs to the slightly bigger clubs. So there was a ladder that sort of had to be climbed. These days, it can be instant superstar exposure, TikTok stars, YouTube stars, what have you. There's still, obviously, we're in a hiatus for who knows how long with COVID. When it comes back, some clubs will be there. Some clubs, many will not be there. So when we're casting a glance into the future about punk or anything, it's really a big question mark. Punk obviously is not a dominant genre. Frankly, rock and roll is not the dominant genre anymore. Hip hop is. So it is a very different world that we're living in right now than the one that he and I were sort of cut our teeth in.
Adam Zand has a question about he made a statement about the Late Risers Club going strong. I dipped into it online and started listening. It's over. It's only if I'm in the office with a European telephone call or something, because it's over at 9 a.m. Our time here. But the thing I was kind of sad about, they kept playing the music from 77 to 85, and punk can't be punk. It needs to be punk. It needs to progress, right? It needs to change. It needs to grow. And what I heard on the Late Risers Club, and I have an incredible fondness for the Late Risers Club. What I heard on the Late Risers Club is a lot of the music I listened to on the Late Risers Club in 78 or 80. I'm really loving Nick Harcourt's Spark Radio on Spotify. Like I said, Nick Harcourt was the one of the better DJs who had The Morning Becomes Eclectic on KCRW out here in Santa Monica and in Los Angeles, very well respected. New York Times did a Sunday New York Times piece feature on him in the magazine about him being one of the most influential people in music at the time. And his show on Spark Radio is it's eclectic. It's really cool. And it still has some edgier punk bands in it too, but it has some really just avant-garde and interesting music. So
speaking of punk changing, Evan wants to know what you think was the first post-punk band and subsequently the first new wave band / artist.
All right. So Jim, I'm going to give them mine and you got to give them yours. Post-punk, I would say Joy Division, because they were so early but they were so musically different from punk, but they were so avant-garde, and new wave had to be like the B-52s.
I wouldn't argue with either of those. I was going to say Joy Division as well. Others from in that ilk, Echo and the Bunnymen, The Cure, certainly. In America, Talking Heads, Television, bands that came up during the punk era, but weren't really strictly punk. I mean, what was strictly punk? How do you define it? It's sort of, there's no good definition for it. And all of these genres sort of blend into each other, punk, post-punk, new wave, the way the title of the book does, in a sense. I mean, they are all connected in a way. When I think of new wave, I guess I think of a more smoother type of sound, perhaps. The Human League, when the synth stuff came in, Depeche Mode, maybe something like that. But it's such broad territory for all of those. That I would definitely go with Joy Division as the key band that came after punk, that was influenced by punk very much so, and yet took it in a different direction and a darker, sadder direction, more melancholic direction.
Was that Steve Lillywhite or Martin Hannett that did the
production? That was Martin Hannett.
Man, and that production is like still today blows my mind.
Well, the funny thing, the thing about that, Michael, is that if you ever heard Joy Division live back in the day, and I didn't, because who did? They never played America, but the tapes or the records that came out later, they were a very raw, rough-sounding band. And kind of, from my ears, disappointing, because I'd had the records, which were crystalline and beautiful and gorgeous. And that was Hannett's doing. The band itself wasn't that happy with it. They kind of liked their rough, raw sound. And then Hannett made them something else and something grander, to be honest. And what is rather interesting now, all these years down the road, Peter Hook, former bass player of Joy Division and New Order, has a band, Peter Hook and the Light. They do New Order and Joy Division songs. And when I talked to him about it, he said, our goal is to play the songs as Hannett recorded them, as people know them, not as Joy Division or New Order did at the time. So in a sense, he kind of got used to, or not only got used to, but realized that was the best sound for the band. And that's how his version of that sounds today.
Yeah, I have those Electric Circus. EPs, and it was cool, but it certainly wasn't as engaging, I think, as what Martin Hannett did. So, I mean, that was another thing. It was a time for musical expression. the other great producers, Steve Lillywhite, you had Steve Lillywhite and Brian Eno doing U2. It was really a time for musical expression of every kind. You had weird bands like the Modettes and the Mekons and Magazine and Howard Devoto, and it really was. It really just was a creative, punk sort of blew the doors open to creativity in the musical space that wasn't there, in my view, when you listen to Rush and Journey and Kansas and yada yada. Like I felt like puking when I would listen to I hope I don't really offend anyone, but I guess I'm trying to offend people, because it's like I thought that was terrible music, and that's what album oriented rock and roll stations, even like BCN at the time, that's why they brought in Oedipus, played all the time. So we have an interesting question from Rich Otero. What are your thoughts about the nearly universal access to photo and video tech that we have now and the continual stream of images coming at us from social media? What does that mean for a photojournalist or portrait artist in the 21st century? I'm going to put this here, so I'm reading here. In the 21st century, is it more difficult for the work to be recognized or appreciated now that everyone has a DSLR and a following? On the one hand, doing what you want with whatever tools are available is a punk, or at least do-it-yourself idea. But are there consequences for the photo and video artist, to say nothing of all the kids at shows craning their necks to stare at phones and phones held in their raised hands? I think technology has decimated a lot of businesses: the music business, the photography business, the video business, being a director, being a still photographer, being an actor, being a musician, and I think it's the same. I mean, at this point in my career, are working towards bigger projects, looking at gallery and museum shows for this work, working on a documentary series about photographers, working on a reality TV show. I have 3 startups. The music business, the photography business, because of that. And not only because there's a glut of talent, because the equipment has made it easier to be a photographer. I mean, you have to remember, these pictures were shot on film. You had to expose the film correctly. You had to focus the camera. There weren't really zoom lenses because they weren't very good. They were really dark and they weren't very good. So you had to have, I would work with 2 or 3 camera bodies on me, one camera body to shoot pushed film and shoot ambient light, the other camera body with a strobe on it. Like, you really had to know your stuff. And these days, the technology has made it pretty possible to do anything, and anyone can do it. And if you screw it up, you can fix it in Photoshop. So yeah, Rich, I mean, to that end, it's not a great market for artists or photographers, and it is hard to stand out. And I mean, I'm just doing different things like book projects and gallery shows and things like that. So I think we'll be at the Howard sometime after COVID, Uzensky Gallery in Boston. I'm new to him. Sorry if I mispronounced his name. So
You want to mention the music that's going to accompany your gallery show, Michael?
Oh yeah. So I've commissioned, when we start showing these gallery shows, I've traveled a lot as a commercial photographer over the years, and I was a Hasselblad master at one point, and traveled when they were owned and when they were headquartered in Copenhagen and not Sweden. I traveled to Copenhagen to teach some seminars, and I went to a museum in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I saw a David Lynch show of his paintings and illustrations, and he created these incredible soundscapes where very Lynchian. You'd walk into the room and there were these speakers around the room and you'd hear ka-choo, 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 woo, woo, ka-choo, ka-choo, like you were in a factory and trains were going through your head. And it added this incredible dimension to the work. And that stuck with me. That's got to be at least 15 or 20 years ago. And that really stuck with me. And I reached out to Peter Prescott and Roger Miller of Mission in Burma, and we're working on the same sort of soundscapes, but obviously all about the music of the time, right? So there's an ambient sound to them, but there's crowds, there's voices, there's like, you have a gallery show about music, and to not have sound with it didn't seem right. Like, it just didn't seem right. It seemed like the sound needed to be part of that exhibition. So that's what'll happen when we show. We have about 10 galleries already lined up to show the work.
Oh man, that's going to be so cool. And it's coming to Boston?
It'll be in Boston. Yeah,
nice. I'm going to have to go. I think we have time for one more. All right. Any history with Boston, not LA bands, specifically Mission of Burma?
Well, speaking of which, we would see Mission all the time, right? I mean, they were a local band. They were amazing. They were loud as hell, but they were really amazing. And I think, the interesting thing about Boston is that there were several bands. Even Mission in Burma, I will include Mission in Burma in that list. There were 3 bands that I can think of that could have been nationally blockbusting bands with the right notice and the right record deal. Human Sexual Response being one of them. Mission in Burma being on, Human Sexual Response didn't get a good deal that they liked for a manager. So, or they turned down a management deal, which was maybe critically part of why they didn't get the exposure they wanted. Mission of Burma was on a local label, La Peste, a local label. I mean, those bands were great bands. A song like Better Off Dead, or That's Why I Reach for My Revolver. I mean, those could have been national hits, right? That could have been, but for some reason, Boston never got looked at or considered seriously by the AR people, and weren't really picked up. Everything, you really had to play New York and be cool in New York to. Well,
the exception obviously being the Cars.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But the Cars, I would put in that sort of new wave group, right? They cross the line between commercial music and using the synthesizers at the right time of new wave and synth pop to be a commercial band, but not really,
Right. They came out of the same milieu, if you will. But yes, they had a sound that was much more radio friendly.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the Howard Yezerski Gallery. We have no date for a show, but it's at 460 Harrison Avenue, A16, Boston. That's down by Thayer Street, where I used to hang out and with the band Ground Zero, and have New Year's Eve parties with James Chance and the Contortions. So, but Christopher, I'm big fan of Mission of Burma, and can't wait for us to finish these 6 pieces. They're going to be in 6 speakers. If there's different rooms, there'll be 3 in a room, and you'll walk around and you'll hear the sounds created by Peter and Roger.
Can't wait to go places and see things and hear things again.
Yeah.
So it's just 8:00 and we're out of questions. So I thought it would be kind of cool if you could, both of you, leave us with something to listen to.
Jim, you first.
Oh, sure, Mike.
No pressure, but make it really cool.
No, it's all right. It's in effect, I'm gonna say what we were talking about before we went live here, and it's sort of contrary to, I don't know if it is or not. There's a band called Hawkwind. They started a long time ago in the late '60s. They still exist, and they have a new album out They're a space rock, prog rock, punk rock, psychedelic band. New album is Carnivorous. That's it, Carnivorous. There's a track called The Virus that is about the world we live in today. It's about a 10-minute track. It's scary, it's prescient, it's forceful, and that's what I was listening to before we went live today, was The Virus. So I'll leave you with that.
I've done a couple of these live events, a couple of them with Oedipus, and he turned me on to, I'm trying to look it up because I actually still buy CDs and rip them to Apple lossless for all my devices. But he turned me on to the Idols, which is sort of still a punk band, right? It's they're pretty cool. I'm trying to look at the other bands he turned me on to, but the Idols are my new kind of reminiscent of punk, but sort of progressed, a little edgier. So
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I have a huge list of artists that I need to go listen to and dream about going to shows again. And I know everyone else probably does too. All right. If there are no more parting words, I think we can say goodnight. We will be sending out your book shortly. Again, you can find those at brooklinebooksmith.com and our upcoming future events at brooklinebooksmith.com/events.
And I want to thank our audience. Very astute questions, great audience. I'm a little reading the chat and the question box and everything else, but they were good. And people popping in like Emmy Malone and any surprise musicians I don't know of here. So
Splendid time was had by all. No, it was good fun. Thank you,
Yeah.
Bree. It was a good time for everyone.
Thank you both so much.
all right, everyone. Thank you
Cheers.
Have
again.
a good night.
Cheers.
Stay safe.
Bye.